Joan of Arc was never supposed to end up in the history books. She was a teenage girl from a small village in eastern France with no military experience, no political power, and no reason to believe she would ever lead an army or become one of the most famous women in history. And yet, her life became a series of mysterious events that we still don't fully understand. So, who was she really? A phenomenon of her time? A so-called mad girl who convinced the masses? Or a victim of a much larger political game? That's exactly what we're going to try to figure out in this video. Drop a like, and let's dive into the story. Joan of Arc was born in 1412 in France, during a period that was extremely difficult for her homeland. And to truly understand the story of her life, we need to take a quick look at what was happening at that time. Long before her birth, a serious conflict had already begun between France and England. So serious that it later went down in history as the 100 Years' War, even though it actually lasted around 116 years. A bit of a paradox. As you can imagine, a war that lasted more than a century was incredibly difficult for both countries. It involved countless figures and a lot of complex, tangled events. So to keep it simple, the French and the English were fighting over who had the rightful claim to rule France. Joan was a peasant girl born in the village of Domremy, which was located near the border, not far from one of the major areas of conflict during the war. So you could say her family was deeply immersed in these events. They were loyal to Charles VII, the Dauphin, who was supposed to become the King of France. But instead, at that time, the crowned King of France was considered to be the English King, Henry VI, the same ruler I've mentioned before, who had episodes of instability and was not entirely sane. At the age of 13, Joan suddenly began to experience visions of St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret. They told her that she was destined to help the Dauphin reclaim the throne and drive the English out of France. And of course, if someone today made a statement like that, they would most likely be sent to a psychiatric hospital by their family and friends almost immediately. But in medieval France, people viewed religious visions quite differently. There were already several deeply respected women who had become famous for similar experiences, like Catherine of Siena and Bridget of Sweden. So no one rushed to label Joan as insane, although people were not exactly quick to believe her either. Interestingly, some modern scholars suggest that Joan may have suffered from schizophrenia or hysteria, and that her visions were actually hallucinations. But in my opinion, trying to diagnose someone 600 years later, based only on records of interrogations, is highly questionable. Even today, such diagnoses are not always straightforward, so any attempts to assign modern labels to people from the past remain very abstract. The truth behind Joan's visions is something she took with her forever. And what do you think? Was she mad, a person with extraordinary intuition, or someone truly chosen by God? So, Joan had a message for the Dauphin received through her visions, but now imagine how she was supposed to deliver it. She was just an unknown peasant girl from a village, separated from the heir to the French throne by nearly 500 kilometers, not to mention the social barrier. It's like trying to suddenly deliver your own vision to King Charles III today. Why would anyone even let you into the palace? Joan first turned to the commander of a nearby town for support. He listened to her and simply sent her home, not believing a word. But she refused to give up. She came back again, and only on the third attempt did he finally agree to give her a small escort to take her to Chinon, where the Dauphin was staying. So why did an experienced commander believe a simple peasant girl, and why did others begin to believe her too? One reason was that at the time, there was a prophecy spreading across France that a maiden would save the country, and Joan fit that image perfectly. In fact, before she was allowed anywhere near the army, she was examined to confirm her virginity, something that today might raise eyebrows, but back then carried real significance. For medieval people, her purity mattered, much like the image of the Virgin Mary. The second reason was the situation itself. It was becoming more and more desperate. The English were advancing on Orléans, and the Dauphin couldn't even become king because he couldn't reach Reims for his coronation. So, in a time of destruction, exhaustion from war, and a very human need to believe in something, Joan managed to convince not only the commander, but eventually the Dauphin himself. To reach Charles, Joan had to disguise herself in men's clothing and cut her hair short. A woman travelling with a group of men would have attracted far too much attention. And what might seem like a simple detail to us today, later became one of the main accusations against her. Wearing men's clothing was considered a crime by the church, and in the end, it was this very choice that would help send her to the stake. When she arrived at Charles's court, there's a legend that he disguised himself and sent another man to pretend to be him, supposedly to test whether Joan truly had some kind of gift. But they couldn't deceive her. She immediately pointed out who the real Dauphin was, saying she could see a crown above his head. It's not surprising that Charles was skeptical of a 17-year-old girl who suddenly appeared at his court, claiming to have visions. But, as the story goes, Joan told him something that only a messenger of God could have known, and in doing so, she won him over. She promised Charles that she would see him crowned in Reims, just like his predecessors, though first they would have to lift the English siege of Orléans. Despite strong opposition from his advisors, in March 1429, Charles entrusted Joan with command of the army. Dressed in shining white armour and riding a white horse, she led them to the city. You have to admit, this is something truly unusual, especially considering the role women had in the Middle Ages. And honestly, even today, if you showed up to your country's president, it's very unlikely you'd be put in command of an army. But Joan managed to do exactly that. It's yet another chain of circumstances that can hardly be called anything other than a miracle. And strangely enough, whether it was luck, natural leadership, or simply the force of her personality, more and more allies began to gather around her, and one victory followed another. Joan herself didn't fight in the usual sense. Although she carried a sword, she chose to carry a banner instead, seeing herself not as a killer, but as a messenger. What's even more remarkable is that, despite having no military experience, this peasant girl was advising experienced commanders on strategy, where to position artillery, how to act, and her advice actually worked. Orléans, the city that gave her the title the Maid of Orléans, was liberated in just 9 days, even though the army had failed to do so for months before. She entered the city to the deafening, jubilant roar of the crowd. By that moment, she had become the most famous woman of her time, and news about her was spreading across Europe at an incredible speed. And since this video is coming out around Easter, it's hard for me not to draw a parallel with the Bible, when Jesus also entered Jerusalem to the cheers and praise of the crowd. And we all know how that story ended, just like we know how Joan's story will end. After this success, Joan insisted that the army move immediately toward Reims for Charles's coronation. As they advanced, more and more towns joined them. Reims opened its gates, and in 1429, Charles VII was crowned King of France there. Joan was given a place of honour at the ceremony, and she declared that the will of God had been fulfilled. But having seemingly fulfilled her mission, Joan began to lose her fortune. She and her troops attempted to storm Paris, but failed. Then came another setback at La Charité-sur-Loire, where Jeanne lost her artillery, which further damaged her reputation. Her once devoted followers began to drift away. Belief in her started to fade, and enemies began to gather around her, people who were eager to remove a girl who had risen far too high. A year later, Joan was ordered to defend the city of Compiègne in northern France, which was under siege by English and Burgundian forces. And on May the 23rd, 1430, the beginning of her end began. Together with her unit, she rode out beyond the gates. The plan was to engage the enemy briefly, weaken them, and then retreat back inside the city walls. Joan rode at the front, so when the troops were returning to the city, she ended up among the last. Right in front of her, the city gates were closed. Was the Maid of Orléans betrayed? No one really knows. Witnesses later claimed there was simply no time to wait for everyone to get back inside, because the enemy could have broken through the gates at any moment, so some had to be left behind, and Joan of Arc was among them. She was taken prisoner and held in a fortress, and soon real negotiations began over her fate. The Burgundians decided to treat her like a commodity and offered to sell her to the English. The price was set at 10,000 livres, which in today's terms is estimated to be somewhere between $4 and $10 million, roughly equivalent to the cost of a luxurious medieval castle. In desperation, Joan even tried to throw herself from a tower, hoping to avoid falling into English hands. But she survived and got away with only minor injuries. It almost feels like, up to a certain point, she had 9 lives, like a cat, because even before that, she had managed to survive several times in battle by what seemed like pure luck. But by then, it seems her lives were finally running out. And what's striking is that the French king didn't even try to ransom his own maid, nor did he fight for her release. Instead, he only vowed to avenge her. And to me, this feels like one of the greatest betrayals in history. Because while her companions and the people from her ranks would try more than once to rescue her, the man who wore the crown thanks to her simply cast her aside as if she was no longer needed. She was then handed over to stand trial for heresy by the Catholic Church. And it's fair to say that the trial was deeply unfair and heavily biased against her. What's remarkable is that despite being an uneducated peasant girl, she managed to defend herself against the accusations. Her main accusers were a group of older, experienced churchmen, led by Bishop Pierre Cochon, who questioned her with complex theological arguments, trying to catch her in contradictions. When they attempted to confuse her with difficult doctrinal questions, she responded in her own way, saying things like, "You ask me about one thing, and I answer about another. And I know nothing of God's love or hatred toward the English. But I do know that all of them will be driven out of France, except those who will die here." The trial began in January and lasted almost until May. Gradually, it became clear that they would not be able to break her, even though she was threatened with torture. And that's when the most terrifying plan came into play. On May 24th, she was brought to the scaffold and told she would be executed immediately if she did not renounce her claims of divine guidance and stop wearing men's clothing. And perhaps for the first time, this 19-year-old girl who clearly did not want to die realized that there was no point in hoping for justice or for any kind of rescue, and she signed the document. But just 4 days later, Joan was once again found wearing men's clothing. It's still unclear whether she did it herself, trying to protect herself from harassment by her guards, or if she was forced into it. After all, if there are no women's clothes in your cell, you can't wear them. And it was this simple act that sealed Joan of Arc's fate, marking her as a relapsed heretic and condemning her to death. The thing is, returning to heresy was considered even worse than heresy itself. And in the end, Joan was finally trapped. She had become too significant, too powerful a figure, and far too dangerous for the English as a living symbol of resistance. On May 30th, 1431, she was burned at the stake in the Old Market Square in Rouen. She was only 19 years old. Her final wish was to see a cross before her death, and an English soldier made one for her out of a stick. She kissed it and held it close to her chest. After her execution, her remains were thrown into the Seine. It might seem like everything was done to erase Joan from the face of the earth, but her story never truly ended. Her family never abandoned her, and 20 years later, at the request of her mother and brothers, she was granted a new trial. Because of the corruption and injustice of the first one, the original verdict was overturned and Joan was declared innocent. But of course, that was little comfort. She could not be brought back. And yet, even that was not the end of her story. It was 1920, and France had just emerged from the devastation of the First World War. One of the ways to lift the spirit of a nation whose land had been ravaged was to canonize one of its historical figures. And that is when Joan of Arc became Saint Joan, the patron saint of soldiers and of France. But in the end, it's not really about her status as a saint. It's about the fact that her name became part of history, and that she clearly had a huge impact on her country and the world. Joan of Arc lived only 19 years, but in that time she went through and accomplished more than some kings do in an entire lifetime. Her story is proof that origin doesn't define destiny, and that even one person can change the course of history if they truly believe. So who was she to you? In St. Joan of Arc, or in a girl who was simply in the right place at the right time? Leave a like, write your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.